Chapter 48, Map. Bonus chapter for 300 Power Stones. Next, at 400 area. Maps, especially during the Middle Ages, were incredibly expensive. Even a simple map would be worth hundreds of gold coins. Obviously, despite having been here for a long while, neither Aina nor Lionel had such funds. If they didn't have a map, they would have no choice but to follow Joan's army from a distance. But if they did this, then the advantage they had in movement speed would be nullified, and they'd lose their chance to prepare in advance. If this happened, their chances at changing history and capturing Paris would end in failure. Lionel almost slapped his forehead. How could he forget something so important? After frowning for a moment, memories gradually surfaced in his mind. During his studies, since he had chosen French, he had of course seen many historic maps. It was just that the maps in these textbooks were incredibly crude and simple, and would at most point him in a general direction. After a while, Lionel shook his head. This wasn't good enough. A single mistake could throw them hundreds of miles off course. We're going to need to raid the military camp, Lionel suddenly said. Aina nodded seriously. This really was the only choice. There were probably cartographers in such a large base, but did they have the time to find out where they were? And even if they did find them, they would be within the city walls, something that would put them at a great disadvantage. At the very least, the military camp definitely had what they were looking for. In addition, if they were found out, it would be comparatively easier to leave the military camp as opposed to a fortified castle. I couldn't leave my axe behind regardless, Aina said. Lionel grinned. Let's do it then. Yeah, one niwa. Big sister, where are Leo and Aina? We'll be setting off tomorrow morning, and our chances at victory will be much better if they're with us. Michael was seemingly the only one in the meeting of commanding officials who didn't have a solemn expression. All of them knew how difficult it would be to retake Paris, so obviously they weren't in the mood to smile. As a result, while the nobles were off drinking and eating, celebrating the new crowned king's ascension to the throne, they were diligently planning. A wisp of a complex emotion flashed in Joan's eyes, but she quickly hid it. They've been taken in by the bishop. Their role is different from ours. Surprised expressions appeared on all those in the room. Though they worshipped the bishop, they had never actually seen him like Joan had. All of their knowledge of him was by proxy of their big sister. So, not only were they surprised, but they even felt a bit jealous. That said, it couldn't be helped. They didn't have great abilities like Joan, Lionel, or Aina. They had expected this result long ago, but hearing it now made them feel a bit inferior. Forget these matters. There'll obviously come a day where you're all rewarded for your service. Is there a need to feel sad? The disciples of the apostles never met Jesus, but did they mope around like you few? Keep your heads up. We got it, big sister. Michael pouted like a child. But won't Aina be needing her axe? How could she leave it here? Michael had no other intentions with his questions. He really was just asking innocently. However, there were others among their band that had weird expressions on their faces having heard this. At this moment, Aina's massive axe was leaning on a wooden weapon rack at a corner of the military tent. But this wasn't the most important point. The key here was that Joan had moved it from Lionel's tent to place it here. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with this action. After all, they would be heading out soon, and Aina wasn't here. But it just felt like there was something they couldn't put their finger on. Just as Joan was about to try and dispel the awkward atmosphere, a voice suddenly came from the tent's entrance. Hello, Miss Joan? Can I come in? Joan blinked in astonishment because the voice was actually Lionel's. What was going on? Michael laughed happily. Come in, come in. We were just talking about you, you lucky bastard. Lionel's grinning face poked through the flaps to find the few of them having a meeting around a table. Since it was late, the space was illuminated by numerous candles. But, despite the fact it was a military tent, it carried a delicate fragrance that made it obvious a woman lived here. Lionel, why are you here? Joan asked as Lionel stepped into the tent. Originally, Lionel had planned to use force to take what he needed, but then he shook his head. When had he become such a brute? The game of American football seemed like a game of all brawn, but he'd lost count of how many times he had won a game with his mind instead of purely his arm. The national championship was just another example. Lionel made a gamble. He gambled that Joan, even if she knew that the bishop's purpose was to kill him, she most definitely wouldn't want others to know this. Lionel was too well liked in the army for her to act against him openly. Even now, the solemn expressions of those commanders here had gained a wisp of a smile when he entered. In addition, there was also the chance that Joan only had a feeling that the bishop had bad intentions and no solid proof. In that case, she might even sigh a breath of relief that he had come back instead. There were other possibilities as well, but they all ultimately led to the same conclusion. Joan couldn't do anything to him right now. I came to bid you all farewell. Lionel smiled brightly, casually sweeping a glance at the strategy maps spread across the table. The Archbishop has given my sister and me a special mission. A few expressions of sadness crossed the faces of those here, causing Joan's expression to change. Since when had Lionel's prestige become so great? However, hearing Lionel address the bishop as Archbishop rested a rock that had been hovering above her heart. Lionel laughed and exchanged a few words with the commanders, embracing the likes of Jean and Michael like they were friends separating from a long while. A long while later, Lionel turned to leave before smacking a palm to his forehead. I almost forgot. If I left it behind, my sister would kill me. Thank you for keeping it safe, Miss Joan. Under a chorus of laughter, Lionel hurriedly scurried to the back of the room, picked up Aina's massive axe, and left with an embarrassed expression. Chapter 49. Resolve. Sister, what's going on? Hours later, when the moon was high in the sky and darkness had enveloped the land, Jean was the only one left in Joan's tent. What do you mean by that, Jean? Don't lie to me, sister. Why did Lionel say that the Archbishop had given him a mission? When Joan heard Jean emphasize the word Archbishop, her pupils constricted. That was right, Lionel had said Archbishop, but all of the commanders beneath her command referred to him as the Bishop. It was an incredibly small detail, but it was a detail someone as intelligent as Jean would never let slip by. Did this Lionel do it on purpose? There were others just as intelligent as Jean under her command. It's just that only Jean was close enough to her that he would confront her like this. Or rather, it could be said that their relationship. Jean's arm wrapped firmly around Joan's slender waist, holding her tightly to his body. Indotoe, Joan said somewhat furiously, her glare seeming to hold an indescribable power behind them. I thought our relationship was better than this, Jean said with narrowed eyes, meeting her fierce gaze. Do you think I'm a fool? What death mission did that bastard send Lionel on? Jean, watch your mouth, She was about to scold him fiercely for his act of blaspheming the bishop, but a pair of rough lips had covered her own, completely stifling her attempt. Joan, you are my woman. I don't know if this person you follow is really God or not, but this is one thing that I most definitely do know. To these words, Joan's reaction was unexpected. Her gaze seemed a bit dim. It was completely unlike a woman who was supposedly in love. It was as though she was resigned to her fate. However, the situation was simply too odd. Joan's standing was clearly higher than Jean's, so obviously it wasn't possible for him to force her into such a relationship. Whether it was backing or individual strength, she left him behind by far. It could only be said that their relationship was almost impossible to understand. Joan, you are a woman too shackled by responsibility and the imaginary. You realize just as I have that there is no God in this world? Or, at the very least, even if there is one, it is most definitely not the God we grew up worshipping. Since things have reached such a level, why do you still allow yourself to be tied down? Seeing that Joan still seemed to have no intention of responding, Jean released her. Though there were flames lighting his loins right now, and he also knew that Joan wouldn't resist if he took her to bed now, he didn't want to touch her when her eyes were so vacant. Do you know the reason I've allowed you to stay by that bishop's side all this time despite my being certain that he was just using you? It's for no other reason than that I wanted you to see it for yourself. Would you have listened to me had I said it earlier? But now you've seen it for yourself. He has no qualms about tricking a kind soul like Lionel. In that case, what do you think he would be willing to do to you? There was finally a change in Joan's expression. A wisp of complexity and sadness pervaded her gaze. However, no matter how she searched, she really couldn't find an answer. God was an important part of her life. This was something ingrained in her from youth. It simply wasn't possible to separate herself from that lofty entity. How much pain had she suffered in her life? She was nothing but a teenage girl, Yet she was leading groups of men in battle. How much burden was laid upon her shoulders? No one really knew but herself. But wasn't that what faith was? Wouldn't her pain be repaid in the end? This was nothing more than a test of her resolve. Joan's gaze became firm once more. This will be the last. This is the last test. Then I'll be laid to rest and enter the heavenly gates. The time she had to go against her conscience? That was simply a test of her loyalty. The times others suffered due to the choices she made? That was simply the test of their loyalty. The world was that simple to Joan. The God she had known in her youth. Maybe he really didn't exist. But there was a new God before her now, and he was real and tangible. She had seen it with her own eyes, the kind of power he wielded, the kind of power he could bestow. Bishop, I won't let you down. Despite seeing Joan's gaze regain their light, there was no happiness on John's face. In fact, the smile he held faded. And, seeing this, it was Joan instead who smiled. Jean.I. Joan's voice was so soft that John felt that his knees lost their strength. Under the dull lights of the flickering candlelight, she heard the clang of armor drop to the floor and a slender hand slip into his. He had hardly reacted by the time he noticed that he was being led toward Joan's bed. It wasn't long before a softness that made his mind go blank enveloped him. Make me forget for another night. Joan placed her lips to John's ear, standing on the very tips of her toes as the last of her clothes fell to the ground. Her hot breath carried a moisture with it that spread an uncontrollable warmth throughout his body. At that moment, he seemed to have completely forgotten about his complex emotions and enveloped Joan's soft bottom in his large hands, lifting her up from the ground and piercing through her without reserve. A spine-tingling moan was barely muffled as she bit down on his neck. Like a young girl swaying in the sea, she accepted all Jean had to give, holding onto his neck with her seemingly weak arms. With each powerful stroke, the lust and resolve in her eyes grew. But she had no idea that her God had already died. Chapter 50. Missions. The Paris of the 21st century, before it was destroyed during the Empire's war for supremacy, was known for its romance and the Eiffel Tower. However, though it might still be possible for the France of the 1400s to be known for the former, it would still be 400 years until the latter was built. But that didn't mean that Paris didn't have its grand sights, much to Lionel's aggrievement. The grand sight this Paris was known for, unfortunately, was a massive castle that dwarfed both Lionel and even Aina's massive axe in size. It stretched almost as far as the eyes could see, and its fortifications made the knees of its attackers weak. Both Aina and Lionel stood a good distance from it, not wanting to alert the Englishmen of their arrival. Even though they had broken free of the French, let alone the English, even most of the French army was completely unaware of this. So, if they got caught now, there would definitely have to be a bloody battle. This is the city we're supposed to capture? What a death mission, Lionel muttered. Aina stood by his side silently as they looked toward the tall, grayish-white walls in the distance. Though her expression had hardly changed, there was a trace of seriousness in her eyes. Lionel sighed. We're still lacking in information. What is Joan coming here to do? If her goal really is to capture Paris like history says it was, why is it our goal to kill her? There were too many things the answer to this question hinged on. For example, if Joan's goal was the same as theirs, should they work with her at the start and only kill her later? What if her goal wasn't the same as theirs? Should they kill her as quickly as possible to avoid later variables and try to capture the city on their own? Could they even do that if it was necessary? The longer Lionel spent in zones, the more he realized just how important information was. If they had wrong or even incomplete information, it could lead them toward doing something irreversible and get them stuck in this place for the rest of their lives. Lionel still shuddered at the thought of what would have happened to him had he killed the priest's sacrificial virgin back in the Mayan temple. He would have never seen his friends or family again. Lionel's gaze flickered. No matter what, my priority if we pass through this will be getting the best zone detector I can. We don't know exactly what her goal is, Aina suddenly said, but it's still possible to make a guess. What are you thinking? Aina bit her lip for a moment before continuing, her gaze still focused on the massive castle in the distance. First, remember that capturing Paris is just the hidden quest. We only need to complete the main quest to get the chance to leave. But Leonel felt like she was leading him somewhere. But there's a reason hidden quests exist. This isn't a game. Everything has a purpose, and not completing everything perfectly has consequences. If it was a weak zone, then the penalty for skipping over a hidden quest wouldn't be severe. But in a potential unique zone like this one, the consequences could be dire. The main reason it's best to complete a hidden quest is due to the fact hidden quests are lingering dangers. When left incomplete, they can bleed into other zones, causing mutations that evolve them and multiply their difficulty. Under normal circumstances, subdimensional zones with higher dimensional grades than the world they're in will not appear. Meaning, since we are only in the process of evolving into the fourth dimension, bronze zones will not appear, and only black zones will. However, if a hidden quest is left incomplete, Leonel broke out into a cold sweat. According to Ina's device, this was only an S-grade zone. Even if it turned out to be a unique zone, its true difficulty wouldn't be too far from this. Yet, it had already almost killed them twice now. Once when Ina lost her mind, and the other when they met the bishop and were trapped. If a mere S-grade zone was already like this, what would a bronze-grade zone be like? The worst part of this was that these things weren't entirely under their control. Even if they perfectly cleared their own zones, what about everyone else? At that moment, Leonel came to a sudden understanding. It's no wonder the Empire wants to gather everyone up. It really can't afford for everyone to work blindly on their own, or we could really be finished. Ina nodded. Now, think back to your first zone. How were the hidden quest and main quest linked? Originally? Leonel smiled bitterly as he remembered how this damned wristwatch almost got him killed. Never mind. The main quest was to repel the Spanish and save the girl. The hidden quest was to kill the priest. Leonel had barely finished when his gaze suddenly brightened. As for Ina, she shuddered when she heard his mission requirements. Leonel had to fight the Spanish? In other words, an army not unlike this one? Alone? She shook her head to regain her bearing. Seems you understand now. The missions never conflict with one another, but what might matter is the timing. For example, your main quest is vague. Which girl? The only way for you to know which girl is to find out that girl is linked to the priest you need to kill. Then that makes things simple, Leonel said. If they can't be contradictory, then Joan's goal is definitely not to save Paris. So I should have just dealt with her earlier. Not necessarily. Like I said, timing is important. Though her goal isn't to capture Paris, she still has a purpose in coming here. And it's likely that even if her goal isn't to capture this city, she will at the very least attack it. That is beneficial to us. Leonel took a deep breath. So that's it. We wait for her to attack while making sure she can't accomplish her true goal, whatever that true goal might be. After saying this, Leonel's heart steadied. This was most definitely not a simple task, but there wasn't much of a choice left. Ina, help me cut down a few trees. There might have been a large mountain before them to climb, but Leonel had no intention of lying down. Since Joan had chosen to betray him, she was his enemy. Chapter 51. Paris 1. You guys are gonna kill me. Bonus chapter for 400 power stones. From next reset onward, it'll be 200 power stones per bonus chapter so that I don't collapse runs away in tears. The English were roaring with fighting spirit. The truth of the matter was that they had suffered successive losses over the last few months. It was to the point where they might be kicked out of France entirely at this rate. However, their morale was still raging. The reason for this was simple. They refused to lose to such an enemy, and they were the true elites of the English army. They had been hearing stories about Joan for almost a year now. The idea that a woman was the one putting their armies in such a sorry state was a great humiliation to them. It was simply going against the will of God. Of course, the English had no idea that the real reason their morale was so high wasn't due to their own will at all. On the castle walls, two men stood side by side. They wore silver armor and the English flag was painted on their shoulder guards. Both swept in different gazes at the roaring men on the tall walls and cold sneers toward the approaching French army in the distance, led by a woman with flowing black hair and her knights. How is it, Raymond? Is she as much of a beauty as you thought she'd be? One of the previously expressionless men grinned, sizing up Joan. If others saw how he was acting, they would definitely be shocked. After all, he spoke about Joan as though she was right in front of him and he could see her every detail. However, she was easily over a kilometer away. If it wasn't for the size of the approaching army and their high vantage point, it would be difficult to make out even her gender, let alone how beautiful she was. You like used goods that much? How do you know she's used goods? The man rebutted. The bishop is our savior, but he isn't a saint. If he really let her go, he might as well castrate himself. The man paused and seemed to think that this made sense. I don't know why I even bother to argue with you anymore, the man said. You pretend like I was seeking her out to be my wife. How could I marry someone who's destined for a coffin in a few months? I just want to have some fun. Raimond glanced at the man but didn't say anything in response. It was only after Joan had crossed the kilometer mark that he finally spoke again. Nigel, there's something wrong with the path of the winds. The man, or rather, Nigel, frowned at these words. The true reason he didn't like arguing with Raimond wasn't because he was no fun, but rather due to his ability. It was an ability that made it hard for him not to be serious all of the time. There might be some variables. Raimond continued. We should be prepared. Nigel's playful demeanor disappeared and he was once more expressionless. Archers! Nigel's roar cut through the battlefield as he took his longbow from his back and slammed its lion-shaped edge to the stone beneath his feet. Aim! Nigel himself didn't aim his bow. Its almost 3-meter-tall form was held in his left hand, radiating such a faint glow that it was almost impossible to see. The French army was still charging. 1 kilometer. 800 meters. 700 meters. 600 meters. The rumbling of horses made it seem like the skies might collapse at any time. Set up a defensive line. Ready the cannons. Shieldmen forward. Joan's cries resounded over the battlefield. Fire! Nigel's voice followed hers as the French crossed the 500-meter mark. It felt for a moment that night had descended. A vast expanse of black, covering the skies like hand, enveloped the lands, followed by the sound of the winds being torn apart beneath their might. The French weren't slow. They reacted to Joan's commands, bringing the shieldmen forward to block the rain of arrows. Towers! Joan roared. Tens of wooden towers came forward, hiding the violent power of their cannons behind their windows as they pressed onward. The French crossed the 300-meter mark nor. Under Joan's commands, they flowed like the water of a rushing river. Nothing was rushed and everything was organized. If a war historian of Lionel's time were to witness such a scene, they would be shocked beyond belief. It simply wasn't possible for an army even of modern times to move so swiftly, let alone one of the Middle Ages. However, these things were simply beyond the normal realm of logic and reason. One only needs to look toward the faint golden glow of the large French flag in Joan's hands to understand that this was no longer just a battle of mortal men. The gods had intervened. Fire! Fire! Nigel roared once more, and a second volley came. More men died horrible deaths. Though the shieldmen did their jobs as well as they could, how could it be possible for them all to come out unharmed? Maybe the most sickening part was that if one ignored the cries of pain and closed one's eyes, the sound of arrows piercing skin was little different from the sound of an arrow hitting the bark of a tree. However, very soon, the French weren't the only ones suffering because the cannons Joan had asked to prepare were ready. Fire! The tall wooden towers stopped just within 200 meters of the castle walls. The barrels of deep black cannons aimed forward before a cacophony of booms resounded. Bang! 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 The cries of the English sounded, and the bloody battle that went down in history truly began. In the distance, Lionel looked on with a serious expression. By now, he had already been in many battles. However, he had never set eyes on a siege before. Though he was prepared for it to be bloody, he really hadn't expected it to be to this extent. We were right to move so far back, Lionel thought to himself. That man shouting out commands and the one by his side are definitely not normal. They're also most definitely not the same English generals who fought this battle according to history. Lionel took a deep breath and his frown deepened. Just what was going on? Who was scheming against Earth like this? But there was an even more shocking realization that made Lionel's spine tingle with coldness. It was only possible for a single group to enter a zone at one time. Until that group succeeded or failed and died, said zone would not open again. What did this mean? It meant that whoever was toying with the matters of the past now had been doing so for at least 1,000 years already. How could they even begin to fight against such a thing?